Hello, chaps and chapettes. Welcome to another episode of the Demystifying the Old Testament series. We're on Exodus 2 now. Please feel free to leave comments, ask questions in the comment section. I will endeavour to read and to answer any of those at a later date. I just thought I might add that in case there were people who were having questions they wanted to answer. So on that note, let's dive straight in. We'll read Exodus 2, verses 1 to 4. And the man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sisters stood far off to know what would be done to him. So here we're introduced to Moses' parents, though not mentioned by name here. They're later clarified in Exodus 6, verse 20, as Amram, his father, and Jochebed, his mother. They were both of the tribe of Levi, and in fact, Jochebed was Amram's aunt. So I think it would be a good time to pause here and let's talk about that thorny and rather prickly issue of incest and close blood marrying that was permitted in the Old Testament. It's an uncomfortable subject and one that often gets thrown back at Christians. But I want us to look at a few examples and really to understand what the Bible's view is on this situation. We have obviously numerous examples. We'll start mainly in the Old Testament because that's mainly where it happened. We've got obviously Adam and Eve in Genesis 4. We have Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 20, verse 12, who are half-sisters. And we have Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19. They're all very different but kind of similar events. And it must be made clear that it is undeniable that God permitted marrying of blood relatives at an early stage in human history. That is clear. We see that. There's no getting around that. Obviously, with the example of Adam and Eve and Noah and his children, they would have had no choice due to the lack of opportunity and availability. Obviously, with Adam and Eve being literally the first humans on Earth, and with Noah having to marry cousins because ultimately, again, they were the only family left on the earth after the flood. But ironically, it's the same dilemma that evolutionists face as well, in the fact that if there's not many people to marry, then by necessity, marrying of close blood is unavoidable. And the reason it's discouraged very much nowadays is mainly, obviously, many issues, but from the main issue is due to genetic abnormalities and the dangers that they pose. As with when obviously genes are passed down, essentially what happens is the previous gene gets copied. And we all know that with any photocopy, any replication, the replication is always of an inferior standard to the previous. Obviously, you tried photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy after a dozen iterations, the quality degenerates quite quickly, and this is the same with human genes. But early in human history, the genome, the genetic code was perfect with Adam and Eve, and even in those first early iterations, it was still very, very good. And so as a result, there would not have been that many, or if any, genetic abnormalities that would have been made manifest due to the replication of the code. But after a couple of millennia, and after the terraforming of the earth post-flood, the genetic code became greatly degraded. So God put an end to the marrying of relatives under the Levitical law in Leviticus 18, 6 to 18, because by that stage there had been sufficient diversity and spreading out of people that it was no longer necessary to marry one's close relatives. And so okay, obviously that is clearly an aspect that even the evolutionists would understand is part of human history. But let's now make it clear that copulation between parents and children has always been forbidden. Always. And it's funny because the greatest example of this and how God is greatly displeased with this action is in the account of Lot and his daughters. And again, often people will point to that and say, well, the Bible is permissive of that, as we read in Genesis 19:30 to 38. But anyone thinking that this is the Bible rubber stamping this practice, they need to look again. Because both children who were born to the daughters of Lot were the Moabites and the Ammonites. And in fact, these two sons developed into two great pagan nations whom the Lord detested. I mean, he truly detested them. And he would often use them to punish the Israelites when they were in rebellion and eventually wipe them out. So that's pretty clear that God was not happy with that incestuous account in Genesis. And there is no other instance in the Bible where God has said, yeah, it's okay for a child and a parent to have sex. That is a complete no-no. So that needs to be dispelled. But again, just to round up, it's clear that God was permissive in early human history due to the purity of the human gene, so that it did allow for that. There was obviously lack of diversity in terms of how many people there were around. And also, there was a necessity, as we explored in the previous chapter, for God to keep the bloodline of his people pure. And once there was enough diversity within his bloodline, then God put an end to intermarrying of close relatives as a result. So, returning to the text, we see that, again, this is one of these kind of things that you need to marry with the New Testament and understand that these are instances where the New Testament reflects the Old. And we see here that both parents of Moses, who is a typology of Jesus, both have parents of the same lineage, i.e. they were both Levites. And in the same way, Jesus' parents, as we explored last time, through both his father Joseph and Mary, were both of the tribe of Judah, and Matthew and Luke both chart that. So again, we see this mirroring of Moses' heritage coming from the same line, reflecting that of Jesus in the New Testament. But then we read here that Moses was a beautiful child. The mother saw that he was a beautiful child. And again, this ironically is in stark contrast with what Isaiah 53:2 says of Jesus. It says that he has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. And so hence the Jews were looking for a good-looking leader like Moses and like Saul and David, who was described as being ruddy and good-looking. But this is where these typological examples in the Old Testament are imperfect. And so the Jews were looking for a good-looking guy, but by all accounts, Jesus was not good-looking. So much so that when he was to be crucified, one of the reasons why Judas would have had to have marked him out with a kiss was that people didn't really know who he was. He wasn't outstanding looking, and but his inner beauty clearly was beyond reproach. And so we see that Moses' mother hid him in the river, not just through parental love, which obviously was the case, but again, we're told in Hebrews 11:23 that she did it through faith. She had faith in God, and so her actions were rubber stamped, was done with the underlying belief and trust in God. And so Moses' mother, she technically obeyed the commands of Pharaoh, as we read last time, to cast the sons into the river, but she did it with a twist. I think this is quite interesting because it almost is a difference between rebellion and resistance in terms of what do we do when people in authority tell us to do things. And oftentimes it's a case of if what they're telling us to do is right or wrong, but then also sometimes the nuance is slightly more subtle. And for me, one of the kind of standout differences between rebellion and resistance is that rebellion is born from a heart of stubbornness and a rejection of authority, whereas resistance is born more from a heart to do what is right and to do what is good, especially in the eyes of God. And so God can very much see the difference in your heart in how you deal with authority based on these two differentiations. And then when we look at the actual term used for the basket, the Hebrew word is tabor or tabor. I'm not entirely sure of the pronunciation. And it's, hopefully many of us realize, but it's the word used only in one other instance in the Bible, and that's described the ark in which Noah took his family and the animals. And again, these are pictures of salvation. So again, this is one of these things that when we're reading it, to understand that God is pointing out all these aspects of salvation in Jesus in these texts, and it's not just a narrative to tell us about what happened in the past, but actually he's trying to tell us about doctrine of salvation and Jesus. And so again, this is a great example of trusting the welfare of that which you possess, especially your children, to God. And she did this with a great act of faith in believing that what she was doing was so that God would look after her son. And again, it's one of these things that pulls hardest on our heartstrings, and I guess ultimately is where our trust in God is most tested. Again, that's why God tested Abraham in slaying and in asking him to slay his son. Again, it's not that God wanted him to slay his son, but again, it's to show and to prove, or to show you the true depth of your heart and where your heart lies. And when it comes to our children, it's very important that we trust God, and we don't necessarily always try and do everything in our own esteem, but then ultimately, when push comes to shove, to allow God to do what he needs to do in the lives of our children. One of the greatest and most heart-wrenching kind of examples was the example of a man who was on the Titanic. And again, if I've got the details wrong, again, please tell me. But according to what I heard, he had only one daughter, and he was a Christian. And obviously, as the ship was going down, he was torn whether what to do, because he obviously wanted to preach salvation to these dying souls. But then he had a child that he had to look after. She was his only thing in the world, and he was her only parent. And I think he read in a passage, I can't remember where it was. Was it in Psalms? But essentially God saying that I will be a father to the fatherless and a husband to the widows, or the other way around. And so when he read that, it was confirmation in his heart that God was going to look after his child. And so he passed his child to someone who was boarding one of the life rafts, and then went to go and preach to the dying souls, and obviously lost his life with them. And the wonderful, incredible thing is obviously the child survived, but then the child went on to be a Christian because she heard of the story of her father, even though she might have been slightly too young to have understood. But God was faithful. And so not only did he save her life, but then she became a great Christian herself due to the faithfulness of the father in giving up his only child for the promulgation of the gospel. Again, that's not always going to be the case for everyone, but it's the underlying heart and your willingness to give up what matters most to you, knowing that God will repay in full that which you lay down for him. And so returning to the text, we read from 5 to 10. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. And behold, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." So it was God's providence that he ordained that Pharaoh's daughters and her handmaids would be the ones at the river. Because obviously due to the dictate of Pharaoh, it was obviously for all the children to be drowned. So there's a high degree of probability that there would have been, guards or people on the lookout to patrol the rivers. But it was God's providence that the only people who would be compassionate to Moses would have been Pharaoh and his daughters, and the only people to stand up against the Pharaoh's decree. And so God made it so. And again, it's interesting because obviously the passage says that she saw that it was a Hebrew child. Maybe it was due to the complexion of the child. Maybe the Hebrew children were light in complexion. The Egyptians were probably known to have had quite a dark complexion back then. Maybe the eye color, we don't know, but anyone who's had children will know that even when children are born, no matter how dark skinned you are as parents, they always come out relatively light skinned because obviously the melanin in their skin has not had a chance to interact with the sun. So I don't know if that's really the case, but for me, and again, I'm reading in between the lines here, and hopefully it will make sense in a later passage, that she may have seen that the child was circumcised. Again, because he would have been at an age where he was old enough to have been circumcised, because he got circumcised after 7 days. And obviously it talks about the fact that he was too big for her to hide. And so my kind of interpretation based on this and other text was that the child would have been circumcised, and hence why she would have seen that it was a Hebrew child. Again, that's not definitive. That's what I'm drawing out from the text. And so Jochebed's faithfulness meant that she got paid as well as raising the child. So God repaid her faithfulness in looking after the child. And it's really important because God wanted it that way, because in Proverbs 22:6 we're told, raise a child in the way of the Lord, and when he's older, they will not depart from it. And so again, confirmation of this passage is that God wanted the child to be brought up with a Hebrew and a godly understanding. And then when the time came, he was handed back to the house of Pharaoh to carry on. But that foundation was already laid so that he would identify himself as God's people. So we'll read in verse 11 to 14. Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" Then he said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." So Moses' motive here is explained for us in Acts 7:23-25, where it says, "Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. On seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand." So Moses felt that through his position and influence and education and maybe good looks and his seeming zeal for God, that the Israelites would have accepted him and they would have seen him as a potential savior, very much like obviously Jesus. But his response in seeing the unjust suffering was to succumb to his wrath and to use physical means to defeat or to combat this evil. Again, this is one of the differences, the kind of anti-parallels that we see of Moses and Jesus. There are many great parallels, but sometimes they're anti-parallels. This is why these foreshadowings are imperfect, because they cannot fully mirror Jesus, because obviously Jesus is perfect and God. And so we see that Moses uses physical means to combat evil, whereas Jesus uses spiritual weapons against Satan. So, and you can imagine Moses surprised, having, done something that was rather kind of put himself out on the line, to then see Israelites beating each other on top of the blows of the taskmasters the following day. And he thought he would have had credibility in their eyes when he approached them, but then check out their response. "Who made you prince and judge over us?" And that is exactly Israel's response, mainly through the leadership when Jesus came in the flesh. Who made you prince and judge over us? We're the princes and we're the judges and we're the authority of what happens on this earth. And again, it's the response of current Israel, especially unbelieving Israel, in terms of the rejection of the Messiah, but also it is the response of the non-believing world. One of the main objections when you dig down to why people do not accept Jesus is because they don't want him to be prince and judge over them. And it's understandable. No one wants that level of authority over them. And so it's for this reason that, again, Moses was rejected and Jesus was later rejected when he came a few millennia later. So in response to his rejection, Moses then obviously fled and spent 40 years in the wilderness till God was ready to use him to deliver signs and wonders and deliver his people. So again, this mirrors Jesus as well. Just before Jesus was to be used by God to deliver his people through signs and wonders and then ultimate salvation, he spends, instead of 40 years, he spends 40 days in the wilderness. So again, you see all these parallels of how Moses is such a strong typological figure of Jesus in all these parallels and anti-parallels. So we read in verse 15 to 19, it says, "When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, 'How is it that you have come so soon today?' And they said, 'An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock.'" So, having done this obviously very impulsive act in killing the Egyptian, Moses must have thought he's completely derailed God's plans and therefore fled in terror and panic to get as far away from God and his people as possible. But the irony is that this is very much part of God's plan, because again, God wants to use the lowly things of the world because he does not want to share his glory. And we're told in 1 Corinthians 1:27, "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty." So if you're in a situation where you're beaten down and you feel there's no way God can use you, the irony is that you're probably most primed to be used by God. Especially when your heart feels that you can't be used by God, God can say, "I will use you, because you will not eat out of my glory, as it were, but you will give all the glory to God, because you know how wretched you are, and therefore you need God to sustain you." And so, due to an extradition treaty between the Pharaoh at the time, Ramses II, and the Hittites, Moses wouldn't have gone to Syria or Canaan in the north, and so he would have headed southeast to Midian. And so this is a classic example of God's will working through the will of men. It's a real kind of paradox about the authority and the ultimate authority of God's will, and how his will works almost sometimes contrary, but sometimes with us. Because ultimately God's will happen. But then we see here that God uses the will of those who are pliant and want to obey him for his glory. But then also, when you pose yourself contrary to God, he will work in spite of your will. And here, even though Moses would have thought, I'm making a decision based on factors that I think are reasonable, which they are, and they're fully his decisions, but then we see also that God uses this to his end, because ultimately he didn't want him to go to the pagan lands of Syria and Canaan, but he wanted to take him to Midian, where he would eventually meet Jethro, and he met Reuel here, who was a priest of Midian, and they would have been of the lineage of one of Abraham's sons, Keturah, who obviously Abraham was a true servant of God. So therefore God used his will and his kind of decision making for his purposes to bring him to a place where he would be surrounded by godliness. And so again, I think it's a wonderful example of how God uses his divine providence and authority to work through the will of people, using their will, but ultimately to achieve his divine purposes. And so, having grown up in Egyptian courts, and obviously the Egyptians were feared and revered fighters, Moses would have been well trained in the art of combat. And so he would have easily fended off these rogue shepherds who are harassing these young women. And again, it highlights Moses' desire to help the downtrodden and to help the defenseless and the weak people of this world, very much reflecting the heart of Jesus. And so we read in verse 20 to 22, "So he said to his daughters, 'And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread.' Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses, and she bore him a son. He called his name Gershom, for he said, 'I have been a stranger in a foreign land.'" So, despite his grandiose dreams of being a great leader and leading the people out of captivity, he seemingly has given up on this dream. He's content to be a shepherd, tending sheep in the wilderness in Midian, and happy to basically embrace his lot. And in spite of the enormous gulf in these two ways of life, having originally been a prince in the most powerful nation in the entire world, to being an unknown shepherd in the middle of the desert, Moses seemed to be content with his lot. And this is a really important aspect of discipleship that God really desires from his people, for us to be content with our lot. We shouldn't always be looking over our shoulder and being envious of the next man or the next woman. To be happy with our lot, to be happy with what God has apportioned for us. Some people, again, can fish with a big net and catch lots and lots of fishes and preach to lots and lots of people. But then sometimes you're just called to preach to or to minister and to witness to a handful of people. And it doesn't matter. God doesn't measure faithfulness based on numbers. He measures faithfulness based on faithfulness. Do you do what he has asked you to do? If it's a small thing or a big thing, have you done it faithfully? And I'm convinced when Christ comes again that the people who will be most venerated won't be the people who have preached to hundreds and thousands and if not millions. It'll be those who have been on their knees praying in their closet when no one's watching, when no one's hearing, but being obedient to God day in, day out. I am convinced those are the people whom God will raise highest on that final day. And so, despite the fact that he obviously is happy with his lot, he calls his son Gershom, which means stranger, because obviously he was a stranger in this land, which kind of hints to the loneliness and the estrangement that he feels from his people. That, in as much as he is happy, that obviously his heart is still to his people, and he thought that, his situation was fruitless, it was hopeless, and this was a fallow period in his life whereby he was pretty much prepared to just live out the rest of his days in this state of obscurity. But even in this seemingly fallow period, God is still working, and he's continuously working behind the scenes. And we should never forget that. Even in situations which seem hard, and it seems that God's not listening, or that we're struggling and being beaten down, we're browbeaten, God is still working, and God has a purpose. Unfortunately, we cannot see it with our finite minds, but again, to trust and know, looking at these passages here, that God is always remembering. He always remembers, and he never forgets us. And he's always working everything out for his divine purposes. So God was essentially turning Moses from a great somebody, to a nobody. Because again, God does not want to share his glory. If you think that's arrogant of God, that's your opinion. But when you are the greatest, there's no one greater than you. So who is there to share your glory with? No one. But even in that, God still says that he will share his glory with us, with those who are found in Christ. For me, I find that staggering, that even in his infinite capacity and love and power and authority, he still looks to share his glory with his children. And again, it speaks of the fact that God uses the empty vessels and those who are most willing to humble themselves. And probably one of my favorite examples, and one of my favorite current preachers, is Paul Washer. And he often talks about the fact that even though he preaches with such power and authority on the pulpit, that when people meet him in real life, they often comment on how boring he is and how seemingly timid he is. And he loves that. And he actually finds it quite flattering, because it ultimately points to Jesus and points to the fact that he has nothing in and of himself, and that all that you see on a Sunday or whenever he's preaching in power is God's power working through him. And the fact that people see such an ordinary, empty vessel, again, just points everything back to God, and I think is the right attitude that we should have, that we should diminish so God can increase. So we read in verse 23 to 24 in closing. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. So we see with the use of the term remembered his covenant after a period of time. And again, it's interesting, and it's important to note that the Bible often uses anthropomorphic terms to describe God. So anthropomorphism is when you use human characteristics, especially on inanimate and non-human objects. So for example, in cartoons where they make animals talk and have conversations, and drive cars, that's a form of anthropomorphism, because those are actions that only humans can do. But in order to make the animals or the characters more relatable, we give them human characteristics, so therefore we can understand them better. And so the Bible often does that, because God is so otherly from us, he's so far removed from us, as we're told that as the heavens are above the earth, so are his ways above ours. And so in many respects, if we were to describe God as he is, with our finite minds, we wouldn't be able to connect with him. It would just be incomprehensible to us. Therefore, in many respects, God has to almost kind of lower himself, or kind of use finite descriptions of himself so that we can relate to him. Otherwise, we just wouldn't. And so we see this term used here of God remembering. It's not that God forgot, or he was kind of like, busy watching TV and then went, oh gosh, yeah, I remembered. It's not. It's an anthropomorphic language used to describe that, the urgency with God, with how God deemed the situation to be worthy of his attention. If that makes sense. I know it's not making a great deal of sense, but it makes sense in my head. And so we see at the close of the chapter, we see the way that Moses came out to look over his people, and we see that he had his heart yearned for his people, and he had concern for them. Again, the same word that was used in Moses' feeling towards his people is the same word used for God here in his concern for his people. And we have this wonderful, tender kind of picture of almost like a mother, how mums are really kind of so concerned about the well-being of their children. You can almost see them whenever they're playing, especially with my wife and my two kids, always kind of, looking out on edge, and they've always got one eye on the children. And that's very much how God is here, and that's that kind of language, that concern, and that kind of almost looking out and wanting to help and to have that heart for your children. But then also we're contrasted with the father-like kind of stance or position that he has, in the fact that in as much as, yes, he wants to go out and hug them and cuddle them, but he ultimately knows that he has to use restraint, because he knows that a better time is coming, because there are many things that we don't know, that God, obviously, as we will later explore, he had to wait for the time of reckoning for the Canaanites and all the surrounding countries, because God had to give them a certain amount of time to repent before he could then enact judgment. And so God has to wait for that. He has to honor that timing, as well as use that time to raise his children. And in the time, he understands and sees that his people are suffering. And again, he has to almost exercise restraint with a heart that is heavy and wanting to help them, but knowing that there's a greater purpose and need for them to wait. And so God is this almost kind of this tension in God's heart that is trying to be played out in this passage here. And so it may seem to the reader and to the Israelites themselves, on first glance, that God had forgotten them, that it slipped their minds and maybe he wasn't concerned. But that is impossible for God to do. His wits aren't diminished with the passage of time, nor his memory with waiting. His timing is perfect, and as we're going to see in the later chapters, it will all be brought to bear, and we'll see exactly why God waited so long. I hope that was useful, and I'll hopefully see you on the next installment. God bless.